May 8th, 2020. 12 kilometers off a disputed island, 3 Japanese fishermen spot 4 China Coast Guard cutters closing fast, armed, outnumbering, and enforcing China's newest crackdown, Operation Flashing Sword. As engines roar and radio calls go out, it becomes a zone defense, a tactical contest that will force Beijing's ships to retreat in humiliation. Why did China's intimidation playbook stop working here? And how did one fishing boat trigger a 26-hour standoff that changed the rules? Every spring, China's Ministry of Agriculture declares a sweeping fishing moratorium across the East and South China Seas. From early May to mid-August, the China Coast Guard is tasked with keeping nets dry, at least for Chinese boats. But in 2020, something changed. Beijing expanded its enforcement orders, instructing the Coast Guard not just to police its own fleet, but to actively pursue and suppress foreign fishing vessels in contested waters. Analysts point to a deliberate escalation. For the first time, the China Coast Guard was authorized to go after Japanese boats operating near the Senkaku Islands, waters Japan has administered for decades. The policy shift landed in the middle of a global pandemic, with Tokyo's attention divided by a spike in COVID-19 cases and economic uncertainty. Some experts say Beijing saw a window to tighten its grip on disputed maritime zones, using Coast Guard cutters as tools of pressure. Others see a calculated move by the Xi administration to project strength at home and abroad, turning routine patrols into high-stakes confrontations. By May 2020, these new orders were in effect. The China Coast Guard began targeting foreign boats as part of its annual crackdown, with the Senkakus at the center of the campaign. Official statements from China describe these actions as law enforcement in Chinese waters. Japanese officials and fishermen saw something else, a hardening campaign of intimidation aimed squarely at their livelihoods. This was not just another season of patrols, it was the opening move in a new playbook, one that would soon be tested, hull to hull, in the waters off Uotsuri Island. At exactly 1600 on May 8th, 2020, 4 China Coast Guard cutters appeared on radar, breaching the 12-kilometer line southwest of Uotsuri Island. The lead vessels, gray-hulled Haijin-class ships, made their intentions clear. Their bows swung toward a lone Japanese fishing boat, a 10-ton craft with 3 men on deck and nets still trailing in the water. The Chinese ships closed fast, twin 30mm autocannons mounted on their forward decks, catching the afternoon light. The contrast was glaring, state vessels displacing over 1,700 tons each, armed and crewed for enforcement, bearing down on a wooden hull that weighed less than a city bus. The fishing boat's captain reached for his radio, voice steady but urgent. His distress call from Ishigaki was picked up by the Japan Coast Guard 11th Regional Headquarters in Naha within minutes. On the bridge, the crew watched as the Chinese formation split, 2 cutters maintaining station and 2 breaking off to shadow the fishermen at close range. The gap between them narrowed to less than a mile. For the crew on the fishing boat, the threat was not theoretical. At this distance, the Haijing's deck guns were impossible to ignore. The water around Uotsuri was familiar, but now every wave felt like a warning. There was nowhere to run. The fishermen were boxed in by vessels that could outpace, outgun, and overwhelm them in minutes. The only thing standing between them and boarding was a radio call and the hope that someone in Naha was already plotting a response. Japan Coast Guard doctrine leaves nothing to chance when a fishing boat is threatened near the Senkakus. The moment China Coast Guard cutters close in, Japan Coast Guard patrol vessels move to interpose, placing their hulls directly between Haijin-class cutters and unarmed fishermen. The spacing is measured in meters, not miles. AIS overlays from later incidents show Japan Coast Guard ships holding position less than 50 meters ahead of the fishing boat, bow to bow with China Coast Guard hulls that outweigh them by a factor of 10. On the bridge, Japan Coast Guard crews execute this maneuver with practiced precision, matching every course change, every acceleration, every feint. There is no bluff. The Japan Coast Guard broadcasts warnings in Chinese over VHF radio and flashes LED billboards that read, "You are in Japanese-administered waters. Leave immediately." The messages cycle through multiple languages, but the meaning is unmistakable. China Coast Guard captains probe for a gap, circling, edging closer, testing the line. Each time a Japan Coast Guard hull slides into the space, blocking any path to the fishing boat. The effect is a moving shield, no weapons drawn, no water cannons fired, just relentless physical presence. For hours, the pattern holds. The fisherman remains protected. The China Coast Guard cutters are denied their target, and the standoff grinds on, unresolved but unbroken. At Ishigaki Port, fishermen talk about the moment a government ship appears on the horizon, a gray hull with a deck gun glinting, and no warning before the chase begins. One captain recalls his hands shaking as he called for help, watching the distance between his boat and the approaching cutters shrink by the minute. He says, "When you see their cannons, you feel very small." Maritime analysts pull up automatic identification system track overlays from that week. The geometry is unmistakable. Two China Coast Guard hulls press in, and a single Japan Coast Guard patrol ship slides into the gap, holding a line measured in meters. The analyst points to the tracks, highlighting how the Japanese vessel never loses its shield. Every time the Chinese shift course, the Japan Coast Guard matches them bow to bow. "This is textbook interposition," he notes. The tracks fit the doctrine exactly. At the 11th Regional Headquarters in Naha, a senior officer explains the decision calculus. He says, "We do not allow our fishermen to face this alone. Our orders are to protect, not provoke. Every maneuver is logged. Every warning is broadcast. The message is clear. If you come for one, you answer to us all." By the second day, the standoff entered a new phase. The two China Coast Guard cutters, still shadowing the Japanese fishing boat, shifted tactics. Instead of trailing in a line, both vessels altered course. One took a northern bearing, the other swung south. Their intention was clear: approach from opposite directions, compress the gap, and box in the fishing boat behind the Japan Coast Guard screen. Bridge crews on both sides watched the radar plot tighten. For the fishermen, the sea suddenly felt smaller. On the Japan Coast Guard side, command and Naha authorized additional reinforcement. A third patrol vessel closed in, its hull cutting across the projected axis of the Chinese approach. Now the geometry on the water changed. 3 Japan Coast Guard ships forming a mobile barrier, matching every China Coast Guard maneuver with a countermove. The cutters probed for a seam, but every bearing was met with a white-hulled block. Engines idled and revved as crews jockeyed for position, radios crackling with warnings and terse commands. The Chinese captains pressed forward, but the zone defense held. The longer the cutters lingered, the more fuel they burned, forced to idle and reposition without ever breaking through. The tactical balance had shifted. For every escalation, Japan could answer with equal or greater force, and the clock was now working against Beijing. After nearly 30 hours inside Japan's claimed territorial waters, the China Coast Guard cutters throttled down and withdrew to the contiguous zone. The pursuit was over. In Tokyo, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga stood before reporters and delivered a message aimed squarely at Beijing. He said, "In order to prevent the incident from affecting Japan-China cooperation, we strongly urge positive action from the Chinese side." The language was measured, the meaning was unmistakable. Japan would not tolerate foreign vessels stalking its fishermen in waters it administers. On the same day, China's foreign ministry issued its own statement insisting the Coast Guard had been regulating illegal operations by a Japanese fishing boat in what it called DOU waters. Beijing demanded that Japan refrain from obstruction in the future. The two governments traded narratives, one framing the standoff as a violation of sovereignty, the other as routine law enforcement. But the facts on the water were harder to spin. The Chinese vessels left empty-handed. The fishermen returned to port unharmed. For the crews involved, the standoff ended not with a clash, but with a silent withdrawal and dueling press releases, each side sticking to its script as the sea returned to gray stillness. In contested waters, escalation isn't theory, it's routine. Every new chase risks real collision, and the stakes climb with each encounter. As both fleets grow and tactics sharpen, the margin for error shrinks. This is where gray zone games end. Real-world consequences begin. Share your take in the comments.